Good morning and welcome to this month's installment for the Solutions of Rural Development webinar series. As a reminder, this has been previously recorded, and if you have any specific questions that pertain to the presentation, the contact information for the speaker is listed near the end of the presentation. Today we are learning about opportunity zones and opportunity funds. This webinar provides a comprehensive background and expert analysis of the new program, as well as recommendations for cities, philanthropies, advocates, and private sector representatives interested in equitable development outcomes throughout our nation's 8,761 newly designated opportunity zones. Our speaker today is Christopher Coase, the Vice President of Real Estate Policy and External Affairs at Smart Growth America. Under his leadership, he oversees Smart Growth America's real estate programs, including Locus, Responsible Real Estate Developers and Investors, and TOD Finance and Advisors, Incorporated, a for-profit subsidiary of Smart Growth America. Under Christopher's leadership, Locus has grown to become a national leader known to be unafraid to tackle some of the toughest challenges facing the smart growth real estate industry today. Over the past 3 years, Christopher has advised cities on community revitalization and sustainable and equitable economic development. In addition, he has facilitated numerous deal-making opportunities that have produced over $1 billion in new smart growth real estate deals. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Christopher.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Christopher Coase, and I'm the Director of Locus, the National Coalition of Responsible Real Estate Developers and Investors, as well as Vice President for Real Estate Policy and External Affairs at Smart Growth America. Today's webinar is hosted by Locus in partnership with First and Main, which is a national coalition representing mid-sized cities and small towns. Today's webinar is focused on the newly created federal tax incentive opportunity zones. This program is one of the most substantial neighborhood revitalization plans to come out of DC in a very long time. And we believe, if properly utilized, will contribute to community revitalization and economic development efforts in America's lowest and distressed income communities across the country. Over the next hour, you will hear from experts on the front lines of creating and implementing the new Opportunity Zones legislation. We will discuss on this webinar the economic context for the program's various tax incentives, and how local governments, states are taking advantage of it, and what you can do right now to leverage your own real estate projects in your towns to make opportunity zones and opportunity funds effective in your communities. We welcome your questions, and we'll address as many of them as possible at the end of the presentation. You can type your questions into the chat box on your screen, or you can tweet them to us at the handle on your screen. Today's presenters include Keenan Fickrey, Director of Research at the Economic Innovation Group, and Gary Heidel, who's the Chief Housing Investment Officer at Michigan State Housing Development Authority. First, we will hear from Keenan. Along with his colleagues at EIG, Keenan played a critical role in the creation of the Opportunity Zones program and is an installation in the final text of the Tax Cuts Jobs Act that was passed last December. With that, I would like to welcome Keenan, and thank you for joining us. Keenan?
Okay, thank you. Am I off mute?
You are ready to go.
Okay, excellent. Okay, thanks everyone for joining today, and a special thanks to Chris and the team for inviting us to be part of this webinar. As I said, I'm the Director for Research at the Economic Innovation Group, and we were there at the beginning of Opportunity Zones, and I'm happy to have this opportunity to take you all on that journey with us. So next slide, please. Now, the Opportunity Zones idea and program is really, it's a product of the geographically uneven recovery from the Great Recession. The Great Recession did not cause all of our geographic and economic divides, but it certainly laid them bare. And over the past several years, our understanding of the gaps in well-being across U.S. communities has improved. Those gaps are long-standing, as many of you know, but I think they have come to the fore of the national consciousness in ways that we haven't seen in quite some time. So next slide. Now, what does it, our EIG's Distressed Communities Index combines 7 different metrics of economic well-being into one composite score, and this was one of the prime advocacy tools that got what was the Investing in Opportunity Act or so much bipartisan support in Congress. And we looked at, we ranked all U.S. zip codes on these 7 metrics and classified them into 5 equally weighted tiers, so 5 quintiles, prosperous down to distressed. And if you look at the average performance of a zip code landing in these tiers across different metrics, you see, really astounding differences across communities. You see poverty rates that, 20% point gaps in high school attainment rates and poverty rates in rates of worklessness. But one of the biggest indicators to us that the problem was going to continue to get worse rather than better was that even during prime years of the recovery, the data we're looking at here covers the years 2011 to 2015, you saw extreme growth in prosperous zip codes where employment expanded by almost a quarter, while distressed zip codes continued to lose 6% of their jobs and 6% of their businesses on average over the period. So the gaps already wide were getting wider. Next slide. So our most recent research in a report called Escape Velocity, which came out just a couple months ago, took these communities where they landed on the 2011 to 2015 data that fed into the Distressed Communities Index and said, let's extrapolate back to the year 2000 and see, what trajectory had these communities been on? What's their trend line looked like to land them where they are today? And we see that, the era of unprecedented prosperity that we've been told we're enjoying since the year 2000 is nice if you can afford it, but in our country's most struggling communities, it looks a lot more like a modern depression, where they've been bypassed almost entirely by 2 recoveries and then hit harder than most other places by two recessions. Now, next slide. Traditional sources of finance do not appear up to the task of kickstarting community renewal and reversing these trends anytime soon. So nearly 1 out of every 4 community banks has disappeared since the year 2008. Some of that's been through mergers and acquisitions, but at the end of the day, it means that if your business model is not attractive to a big bank's algorithm, you're unlikely to get funding. In real terms, small business lending remains down by a quarter and has barely recovered since before the recession. And the highest tolerance risk capital, venture capital, 75% of that is sequestered in just 3 states, and then even narrowly when you chop it down by industries, and then narrowly again by demographics. Next slide. Even access to mission-oriented capital is deeply uneven. So for all of the good that community development financial institutions achieve in communities across the country, over a quarter of U.S. counties received no CDFI funding at all from 2011 to 2015. And really, it's under a quarter that received any meaningful investment on a per capita basis. So there's just simply not enough money in the community development finance game to start to change these national trend lines. And even philanthropies and foundations end up, looking a lot like venture capital when you look at how concentrated their investment is in particular markets or, among particular stakeholders who have the capacity to, engage in the grant writing and, speak the same language as donors based in New York and elsewhere. So the next slide. The Opportunity Zones legislation it all started with a white paper back in, I think 2013 it was, bipartisan white paper, which was EIG's first published research product. That was co-authored by Jared Bernstein, who had just finished up being Joe Biden's chief economist on the left, and then by Kevin Hassett, who at the time was the economics chair for the American Enterprise Institute. Now is, of course, President Trump's chair of Council of Economic Advisors. And they ended up, I think, recognizing the need for a new federal program to unlock private capital to facilitate economic growth in distressed communities. And that they, we've had experiments like this before in federal policymaking. I think you can debate whether or not they've been successful, but we've certainly learned a lot of lessons from the experiments that have been done in the past. And here in this white paper, they kind of teased out those lessons and then sketched out what an alternative that could really move capital at scale and would be lower cost to the taxpayer and more market-based, what that would look like. It turned into a bill that was called the Investing in Opportunity Act before it got wrapped into the tax reform package at the end of last year. That piece of legislation was spearheaded by Senators Cory Booker and Tim Scott from the left and right in the Senate, and then by Representatives Ron Kind and Pat Tiberi from the left and right, again, respectively, in the House of Representatives. And by the time it was rolled into the tax reform legislation, it had 100 co-sponsors of both parties. So real broad bipartisan support for the idea. Next slide. So what is it? It's designed to be a simple, flexible vehicle for investors to take a bet on and direct stake in the future of communities that today are struggling. It is relatively narrow in that it targets a very specific but very large pot of capital in the U.S. economy, and that's capital that right now is tied up in capital gains elsewhere. So, we're at asset prices are near historical highs. The stock market is, well, until this week, it was still reaching record highs every day. That's a lot of kind of idle financialized capital waiting on the sidelines of the economy. The idea is, what if we could take just a fraction of the winnings that investors are sitting on from this recent period of growth and get that dedicated towards or channel that towards community development and get that dedicated in investing in a future for U.S. communities. The idea is that ultimately, or the model that's part of this program is that a new asset class and almost a new sub-industry of the financial industry should be born here with opportunity funds being a new option for investors to place their money, and opportunity zone assets being, as I said, a new asset class. And then, as Chris mentioned, this is the first new national community investment program in at least over 15 years, and it has the potential to be one of the largest distressed community stimulus efforts that we've seen in a long time. So before we get into kind of what this actually is, I think it's helpful to kind of compare it side by side to past efforts right away. So what makes, next slide, please. What makes Opportunity Zones so unique? It is an investor incentive, and it pertains exclusively to capital gains, both on the front end, that's the money that's incented to go in today, and then on the back end, the biggest benefit to investors is if they hold their Opportunity Zone asset for at least 10 years, they don't have to pay any capital gains on that new investment that they made in an Opportunity Zone. Other programs or most economic development incentives, as typically conceived, go towards single corporations, and that's not the case here. You're asking investors to really work their magic and invest in the future and put their skin in the game to make that happen. It's also designed to concentrate capital rather than diffuse it like some other programs. I think some people probably wondered why governors had to down select, why only 25% of their low-income census tracts would be eligible for investment here. Why not all of them? And that's because this piecemeal approach of kind of sprinkling capital and investment all across the map ends up potentially giving a little bit to a lot of people, but not enough to really systemically catalyze change in a meaningful way anywhere. So here, especially when the incentive is tied to the appreciation in value of the investments that investors find in Opportunity Zones, you want to concentrate that capital to increase the chance of appreciation. It also rewards patient capital. All incentives here are not, tied to signing any papers or putting any shovels in the ground. They're tied to the longevity of the investment, and the biggest incentive coming if investors hold it for 10 years. And it's an equity capital program. It is not a debt or loan program. That means that some businesses might not want to offer equity stakes to investors, even if they're in opportunity zones. They then can forego opportunity zone financing, but for others, equity capital is often the scarcer form in these communities. So this should be an important boost in the access to capital landscape. There's no upfront subsidy here. It does not pick winners. And it can move at the speed of the market. So we're all kind of in a holding pattern right now while Treasury writes a lot of the key rules and regulations that are necessary to have in place before the market ramps up. But once the rules of the game are set, there are no applications and no approvals for investments like you got with the new markets tax credit. Really, it can move at the speed of normal transactions and deal making and investments, and that's new and really important. It's also designed for startups in mind. We'll get into over the course of this call some of the particulars of the program that make it more likely to finance new and operating businesses than some past efforts did. Again, new markets tax credit would be an example there. And it's also, it's not designed to award a big incumbent company looking to make its next site location facility. I think they get enough help from others already. And lastly, it gives investors an actual stake in the community's future. It doesn't reward them for making an investment. It rewards them for, creating a valuable company or bringing market activity back to a main street or something where that was previously a weak market scenario. So next slide, please. So what makes it so promising? I'd say three characteristics. Its flexibility, its scalability, and its simplicity. So on flexibility, the needs of U.S. communities are really diverse, and opportunity zones can invest in, or opportunity zones and funds can support a wide variety of mutually reinforcing activities. You could envision a group of opportunity funds, buying brownfield assets along a main street, refurbishing them, building totally new housing projects or commercial developments along that same street, and investing in the companies that would then occupy those spaces and become the employment providers down the road. So funds doesn't have to invest in all those things, but funds can invest in any number of them. Also, there's scalability. There is no statutory cap here on the amount of capital that can flow into opportunity zones. So the scale of this program is going to be where the supply curve meets the demand curve. So where investor appetite meets the number of investable opportunities in the country's opportunity zones. And then lastly, simplicity. It probably doesn't seem very simple at this point while everything's new, but eventually, because there are no approvals or anything, investors are going to know, what's in and what's not, and they don't have hiring stipulations to meet. They don't have, local purchasing requirements to meet or anything like that. So they'll be able to, any criteria that you layer on something leads to, increased risk aversion and less uptake among investors. So that was a lesson learned from past programs that, keep it simple and let the dollars flow. So next slide, please. There are three components of zones, or three components of the Opportunity Zones program. Break it down into zones, funds, and investments. So zones, the map is set. You were all, or many folks on this call were probably involved in designating the zones in their communities. So those, any businesses that start or expand in those facilities are now, in those communities, are now eligible Opportunity Zone businesses if they wish to be. And any, property, brownfields, or vacant sites are ready to be invested in by opportunity funds. Then opportunity funds, we'll get into this more later, but essentially all investment that wants to take advantage of the tax benefits inherent in the Opportunity Zones provision of the tax code. Now, they need to flow through funds, which opportunity funds is a very flexible vehicle. They can be any size, they can be any kind of degree of management expertise, they can be closely held, or they can be kind of more like a mutual fund with lots of different investors and professional managers. The market's going to determine, what this fund landscape looks like, and I hope many of you on this call are also involved in conversations around, potentially standing up funds in your community that are committed to gathering local capital and then making sure that it stays investing in the company's locality's future. And lastly, investments. So there are three types of asset classes that opportunity funds can invest in. One would be the originally issued stocks of opportunity zone businesses, so new issue stocks or an increased number of or new shares in an existing business. Second one would be partnership interests. This would apply to many real estate development projects, of course. And then opportunity funds can own tangible business property directly themselves. And I'm sure we'll get into more of those scenarios as we proceed. Next slide. So back to the map of opportunity zones. The map is now in place. It was, I believe, a week and a half ago now that Treasury certified the opportunity zones from the last 4 states. So we know now that in the 50 states plus DC, so not including the territories, there are 31.3 million Americans living in opportunity zones. Zones are currently housing 24 million jobs and 1.6 million business establishments. They are just over 3/4 metropolitan and just under 1/4 non-metropolitan. But if you break it out by the zip code, the density of the zip code they're in, it's more equally divided between rural, suburban, and urban. So we have a real variety of places here. I didn't include a slide kind of profiling what the opportunity zones are across poverty rates and median income ratio and things like that, but suffice it to say that the governors ended up nominating places that were needier than they needed to in this process, which I think was good and allayed a lot of the concerns and fears that some stakeholders had up front, that governors would choose places that maybe didn't actually need the incentive. So next slide. So to tee up the conversation, I think that localities should aim big when they think of what opportunity zones can finance. It's really flexible. They can finance startups. They can finance housing. They can finance commercial developments. Next slide. They can also be used in tools for building an innovation district. They should layer on top of your existing brownfield incentives or plans to refurbish either historical properties or structures that have fallen into disrepair or long-term large tract pieces of blight. Opportunity zones should really change the economics of brownfield investment at the margins in important ways. And even I think several communities, especially out west, are figuring out how they can use opportunity zone financing to invest in energy assets and set up solar farms and things like that. So it's a real exciting gamut of activity that can be financed here, and it's I will hand it back over to, I'm not sure, Gary or Chris next to tell us about how it's shaping up in particular localities.
Thank you, Keenan. I think what we all heard was a great overview of the program and some of the things that we could see happening on the ground. But of course, as part of this discussion, is going to require state, local governments, as well as the private sector working hand in hand. And so I'm really excited to have a friend and really a thought leader in this space, Gary Heidel, Chief Housing Investment Officer of the Michigan State Housing Development, to really talk about how the state of Michigan is approaching this as potentially as a best practice or provide some of the local elected officials and local governments some ideas on how they should proceed. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gary. Gary?
Thank you, Christopher. Well, first I have to say that it was a surprise when the opportunity zone showed up in the federal legislation. We weren't sure, we knew that was going to happen, but it was a very welcome surprise. And ever since it happened, we have been running, as our governor often says, dog ears to keep on top of everything. One thing I want to note is the initial work was a collaboration between MSHDA, the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, and the MEDC, which is the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. We're two independent type agencies who have worked together for a very long time in doing a lot of economic development, including community development and housing. I want to talk a little bit about how we went about identifying zones, because it helps to show the base we started from. What we did is we got some key researchers from both Michigan and MEDC to come together and literally did work 24/7 to come up with our zones. Initially, the governor had told us he did not want to apply for an extension. He wanted to apply later in March, and so that's what identified our workflow. What we did is, much like the data that EIG had come up with, we had come up with 12 economic variables, some of the same, some different ones, and came up with our 288 zones that we were going to eventually nominate. One of the things we did before recommending these to the governor, which was a very important piece for us, was to contact some of our major metro area collaborations, which would include local governments, it would include the business analysts, and it would include what we call collaborative development corporations that are throughout Michigan, and asked them and gave them an idea of what we were recommending and asked for their input. Part of that input was to give us an idea of potential projects. Now, obviously, at this time, they didn't know what eligibility would be, but these are really strong economic development professionals, and they had some ideas of some things that shovel-ready or something they were working on. Part of that was also they gave us some changes to the zones we had recommended. So when we finally did go to the governor, our listing was based on certain economic variables, but also it was based on types of real projects that could be potential for financing through this tax incentive. The governor did make some changes. He wanted to see a little more regional distribution. So one of the things we did was to make sure there was a zone in every county, and a zone for the governor's Rising Tide initiative, which is really targeted to small communities that are having economic distress. A key part of our whole strategy has been something that's been going on in Michigan since the governor's election 7.5 years ago, and that is the Regional Prosperity Initiative. So Michigan has been divided into 10 areas throughout the state. They kind of correspond with regional planning agencies, but not quite. And in each one of these regional areas, state agencies have had to identify a lead person, but also they have to identify field staff who will work in those regions with local governments, economic development agencies, and things like that. As part of the Regional Prosperity Initiative, the governor has identified 8 or 9 agencies that he especially wants to work together. He sees them as the key to economic development and local government stabilization. And so besides MISTA and MEDC, those other agencies include the Department of Transportation, the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Environmental Quality, the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, the Talent Investment Agency, the State Land Bank, and the Department of Treasury. Those agencies work together in Lansing as part of a senior staff group talking about policy, how they interrelate with one another, and driving the governor's placemaking and talent attraction strategy. The other thing that they do is they work extremely closely with local governments in financing projects. They work closely with the collaborative development corporations. So we already had, by the time opportunity zones came along, a very strong network of local cooperation and an idea of where the projects will go. And that was a big part of what we do in Michigan. we bring that regional team, the state regional teams together on an annual basis so that we can talk to them, we can talk about their efforts, see the kinds of projects they're working on, and it's kind of things that we might want to finance in the future. So you can imagine what it meant for us when we saw a new source of incentive come along and what that could mean in terms of us financing projects. One of the things we've done with that regional network is that we have MEDC and MISTA have hosted our own webinar. It was last week. We had over 150 of these target groups on that webinar talking about some of the things that you heard earlier about the basis of opportunity zones, what they are, what it means, answering a lot of technical questions about the things they might be thinking about and what the kind of things they want to be talking about locally. We've really encouraged even a higher level of collaboration locally within those 10 regions. One of the things I've done is I have sat down and talked with the MEDC Community Action Team about the kinds of connections we need to make around community development and placemaking. I've talked to the MEDC Business Manager Team about the connections we need to make around business development and industrial development. We'll be talking to the collaborative development corporations, private sector economic development groups, about the role they have to play in looking at projects and what they can do with the MEDC in terms of looking at potential projects. And then bringing in the local governments. Some of our local governments are fairly good at this kind of business. When you look at some of the activities that have been going on in Detroit and Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, Lansing, even Flint and Muskegon, they have really organized around this regional system. So you have regional business teams, you have regional community development teams, and they have a really solid connection of what's going to be happening in their communities, and they know the project. So we feel pretty well prepared that once Treasury defines what the guidance on creating of opportunity funds in terms of self-certification, that we will be prepared in order to work with a lot of those funds. One of the things we started to do, as a matter of fact, we have a meeting this afternoon, is we have our senior, we call it META group. META, frankly, stands for metamorphosis, kind of a strange name for a government group, but they've evolved over time to become those 9 agencies that work very closely together and then implement different policy changes through their field teams. MISTA will take to its board on this Wednesday, tomorrow, changes in our qualified allocation plan for low-income housing tax credits, and we will provide points for any investment in an opportunity zone. I've also had conversations with the Department of Natural Resources. They would like to see if there's some opportunity around some new initiative they've been developing around the kinds of businesses you see in natural areas. And the MEDC, in a meeting with them, they'll be looking at their programs and how they can work together with potential investments from opportunity zones as part of what they can do. So those are some of the policy changes. We're very early in the process. We've heard about what a lot of other states are doing. In an earlier conversation with Christopher, he had some ideas about incentivizing different kinds of funds. We're very, very open to that right now. This is, in our view, so new that you just have no idea how creative this is going to be going to the future. I've been working in economic development for a few decades. I've never quite seen anything like this. So this is going to be very interesting. We are putting, in terms of communication, we're putting all of our information that we have on our website, which is www.michigan federal.gov/MSHDA. So that's the way that we're starting to communicate with our Michigan team that's going to be very involved in all of this. We're also having a lot of conversations. I'm getting out and meeting with various regional groups. I was in the Kalamazoo area, which is in West Michigan. I've been up north talking to local government officials in the UP, and we'll be continuing to do more of that. One of the things we've started having too is we've actually been having investors who want to create funds come to us and have some interest in some things they may want to do. For example, I did have an investor who has social impact investors as part of their organization, and they're planning to create a fund, but what they want to do is they want to invest in affordable direct lending projects that require bond financing in conjunction with low-income housing tax credit in the Detroit opportunity zones. And they're actually going to be in Detroit, I believe, this week to really start scoping out potential projects that they can be a part of. So I think when you saw some of the comments earlier about, especially as it relates to affordable housing, you really got to get moving. That's very true. They sat down and talked with us. They've asked us about potential deals. They've talked to us about potential sites. And so that's one thing that we've seen happening there. I had another conversation with someone who wants to create a fund, and they were looking at some potential municipal bond financing in conjunction with an opportunity fund to do small business startups. They haven't quite defined exactly what types of small businesses yet, but they're very excited about that. I had a conversation just late last week also with the head of the Small Business Association in Michigan, and they're very interested in thinking about some kind of state tools that we could develop that might help to really encourage financing too. So that's just starting to happen for us. One thing, obviously, what we're responding to is that our governor is only 6 months on his term, so full-scale implementation of opportunity zones will probably happen in the next administration, but we're setting the base right now. I think as we look at everything, one area we're really challenged by, and talked a little bit earlier about this with Christopher, is the ability for us to connect with funds. Allowing them to be self-certified means there's not going to be much of a list at Treasury that says, oh yeah, here are all the funds, do what you want to do. They're going to happen, and we may not know about them. So we're looking at different kinds of ways to connect with people who want to create funds and work. One of the things we're talking about is we're going to request that the governor make an announcement that Michigan is open for business. If you're interested in working with state government in conjunction with your opportunity fund, then there's a form on the MISHDA website. Please fill it out and send it in. What we will then do with that is look at the type of fund portfolio they're trying to create, and we will move that to various state agencies so that they can make connections to see how we can work with funds who have a particular type of thing. And I think the other thing we're going to be doing is connecting more with some of our metro areas where we see a real opportunity to do some different things. A challenge will be for us is working in some of our small towns and rural areas, but we do have a lot of agribusiness going on out there and some other kinds of things, and we're looking for ways to maybe provide them some technical assistance to help them have a vision of what kind of things they would like to see invested in their community, and talking with some groups on how that might be done. So that's where we're at right now. It's very exciting. I think this is about one of the third biggest initiatives I've worked on in my career coming out of the federal government. It is certainly one of the most exciting. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. As I think we've heard a really great overview of the program, and really hearing on the front lines how a state like Michigan, who really was one of the first states to really create a very good process on integrating and designating their opportunity zones, and then begin to think about how they can leverage that. With that, I want to spend a couple of minutes talk about some of the resources that we have here at Smart Growth America, Locust, and at First and Main, and also provide some observations based on conversations we are having with the real estate industry that may be applicable, that may hopefully give you some ideas on how you should take advantage of this program. First and foremost, about a month and a half ago, Locust, working with our colleagues at Smart Growth America, launched the Locust Opportunity Zones Navigator, which is an interactive map for individuals and organizations who are interested in understanding the economics, the housing affordability, as well as other development opportunities like transit-oriented development that are in opportunity zones. So you could either go to our website right now, you can type in your address, and you can find out whether or not your opportunity zone has transit, brownfields, as well as provide you housing and transportation data, and so much more. Next slide. In addition to that, one of the things that we have been working on nationwide is better understanding how the opportunity zones can actually achieve equitable development. And from our perspective at Locust, we believe in order to truly achieve equitable development through this tax incentive, it's going to require governments, advocates, foundations, and the private sector working together to ensure this program is a success. As both Keenan and Gary alluded to, this is a market-based approach to economic and community revitalization. And for community revitalization efforts to truly be beneficial to the community, it's going to require everyone to set up the policies in place. And so what I want to do now is just kind of talk about some of the main actions we believe for the various stakeholders should be doing today before the Treasury released their final guidelines. Number one, as Gary highlighted in his comments, and as Keenan had pointed out before, there are a lot of private interest in the Opportunity Zone and Opportunity Fund discussion. As Keenan pointed out in his presentation, there's over $6 trillion of unrealized capital gains. One of the things we recognize at Locust that there are over 8,700 Opportunity Zone census tracts in Opportunity Zones, and they are not all created equally. We believe that if this program is going to be successful, it is going to be incumbent on the state and local government to inspire confidence in a private sector or private investor to invest in their communities. What do we see? How do we see that happening? Number one, we believe that states and localities that work collaboratively to create their own opportunity funds and have identified specific project pipelines, whether it's startups, whether it's housing projects or economic revitalization projects, those communities that have done that will be more likely to rise to the top of the list of interest for real estate investors versus to the lower of the list. Secondly, now is the time, not tomorrow, not 3 months from now, not next year, but now is the time for communities to do an assessment of what would happen if the Opportunity Zones was a success in your communities. Are you sure that you're protecting your current vulnerable populations, whether it's residents or small businesses? And so one of the things that we are seeing across the country is that a number of communities are beginning to think about implementing do no harm policies. For example, inclusionary housing policy to ensure that any new development has reserved housing for middle income and low income families. Secondly, making sure that property taxes for elderly do not go up too high if the market shifts or accelerates. Those are examples of some of those do no harm policies that localities and states should be putting in place. And lastly, as Gary had pointed out, because there's no reporting from the federal government and because most of this program is in private hands, you and I all have potentially, if we're blessed, to have unrealized capital gains, whether in our stock or in investment properties or in other ways. Those decisions are being made by private individuals and corporations. However, the government has the ability to either A, ensure that those investments are done in a way that hey, using your local entitlement process or your zoning code to incentivize equitable development outcomes. Or two, remember, in order to create an opportunity fund, it only has to be a corporation. Some states, some localities may think about how to incentivize equitable opportunity funds to be formed in their states, which allows them to not only track, but also give additional tax incentives for individuals who create corporations or opportunity funds in their state to do it the right way. When it comes to advocates, of course, not only advocating for mission-driven equitable development is an activity that we see, but also there's nothing stopping housing advocates or entrepreneur organizations for sponsoring their own fund. For example, one of the things we're learning is that right now a lot of housing advocates and startup incubator spaces have project pipelines. They know the local residents, they know the policies, they have projects. Compiling those projects are one sure way to attract investment. When it comes to foundations, one of the things we see here is a great opportunity for the foundation world, philanthropic world, to really take a leadership role. Just recently, Kresge and Rockefeller together submitted an LOI to encourage fund managers who are interested in creating opportunity funds, particularly those that are equitable development based, to submit concepts to them that they would be willing to potentially pledge $25 million to support those funds. In addition to that, one of the things if you're a government or an advocate reaching out to those foundations, they have fund managers on staff, particularly operating their PRI dollars. Foundations can play a huge role in shaping the opportunity zone discussion on the ground. And then lastly, from the private sector, there are a whole host of issues and ways that the private sector can support this program. But number one, I think from our experience in Locust, is that developers all the time and investors recognize that if you invest in a project, no one wants bad news. No one wants bad PR. And one sure way to do that is to ensure that in your business practice that you actually incorporate equitable development principles. Here at Locust, we subscribe to what is called the triple bottom line perspective, that not only should you be caring about profit, but your project should also benefit the people and also benefit the planet. Also, we recognize that this program, as Keenan pointed out, is a 10-year, has a 10-year horizon. The longer your investments are in a community, the more tax benefit you get. However, because of the level of uncertainty that both Gary and Keenan had discussed, we recognize that the projects that will most likely not only maintain value of your original investment, but also will provide triple bottom line outcomes for the community are those projects that prioritize smart growth investments, that prioritize transit-oriented development, but also private sector projects that self-report are more likely to get greater community buy-in. So those are examples of some of the things that we believe that stakeholders in the government, advocate, philanthropy, and private sector should be doing now to ensure that this program is a success. Next slide. Now, one of the things I want to do here is we have a couple of examples that we're seeing across the country where opportunity zones, particularly the opportunity fund portion, are impacting projects today. In the Northeast, we are seeing opportunity funds being created to purchase land around transit-oriented development sites to promote mixed-use development. In this particular example, the fund actually purchased the land and entered into a joint venture partnership with a real estate developer as part of their project profile. Next slide. We're seeing it in other places across the country where a real estate developer actually has land. However, they have traditionally they wanted to do a affordable housing project. But what they've decided to do is instead of, in addition to going through and applying for a low-income housing tax credit, they're engaging with that investor to say, instead of just using your normal capital dollars to purchase your LIHTC credits, but to use your unrealized capital gains dollars in addition to your capital dollars, and then that allows the investor of the LIHTC credit to not only get the benefit of the tax credit, but also get the benefit of the opportunity fund tax incentive as well. Next slide. Also, we're having conversations with developers who are recognizing that as a key issue, not only is housing a critical issue, in a lot of revitalization conversations, but also small business retention. And one of the options that we see, or scenarios that we see coming out of the ground potentially, is the fact that as communities revitalize their main streets or their corridors, it's oftentimes hard to keep mom and pop stores that have been in those communities for years. One strategy that we're seeing is that developers working with those small mom and pop stores would say, look, we're going to redevelop this building, we're going to provide additional capacity, additional density. However, oftentimes the developer cannot get the commercial space underwritten by the bank because the small business is not credit worthy. Well, the example that one of the projects that we're working on right now is potentially where the developer, in exchange of getting equity in the small business, is able to reduce the lease payments for that small business, so that small business could then also move into that space, and then two, use the fund in itself as a backstop in case that business does fail. So these are just three examples of how people are beginning to think about how can they use the Opportunity Zones program on small businesses, protecting affordable housing, promoting affordable housing, as well as with transit-oriented development projects. Next slide. I think at the end of the day, there are probably 5 key things that people need to remember. Number one, if you're a locality or at the state level, now is the time to make sure you have a task force that's working day in, day out to align state and local incentives and processes so that when the private sector is looking for an Opportunity Zone project, they have a one-stop shop. Number 2, states have the ability to incentivize the formation of equitable opportunity funds. As I said before, as it was stated before, opportunity funds are just a simple private corporation. States have the power to incentivize that, hey, we want you to create your opportunity fund in my state, and then by doing so, we can waive the application fee. We can potentially provide you an additional tax benefit. By doing so, it allows the state to not only track who is creating opportunity funds, but also to help shape the marketplace of opportunity funds activities in your state. Number 3, and I cannot stress this enough, as it was stated before, this is a patient program. However, it does have some key elements. Number 1, there are 3 main tax incentives. If a developer or an investor invests in an opportunity fund into an opportunity zone, if they keep those dollars there for 5 years, they get a tax incentive at 10% reduction on their unrealized capital gains. If they keep it there for 7 years, that goes up to 15% reduction on their initial investment. If they keep those dollars there for at least 10 years, they get that 15% and capital exemption on all taxes on any appreciation on that initial investment. The issue here is that really means a city and locality has to understand the investment strategy of the investor. Every investor is not going to be a long-term investor. Every investor may not be a short-term investor, but understanding that your projects are aligned with their risk model. Number 4, if you have not done so now, do it. You have to put an attainable housing strategy in place. Too often, we have seen community revitalization efforts where localities did not ensure that affordable housing was the number 1 priority. Trust me, if your community revitalizes and you haven't had affordable housing policy in place, it's going to be more expensive, costly to put it in place later on. And last but not least, I think one of the things we've heard today is that this project is going to allow 1,000 flowers to bloom. There are going to be different approaches. There's going to be a different good and bad project. One of the things I would suggest both to the public sector and to the private sector is to ensure that you prioritize projects that are shovel-ready, that are simple, and that are easily reportable and assessed. So with that, we'll take, if you're interested in learning more about how you as a locality or a private sector can take advantage of the Opportunity Zone program, please feel free to reach out to Locus. We recently formed an advisory group, which includes lawyers, tax accountants, and policy experts across the country to answer your questions or potentially provide consulting services. And now with that, we will close out with the remaining time for questions. All right, so the first question we have coming up is, do we know when Treasury will be releasing their guidelines on the certification process for the Opportunity Fund? So the short answer of that is initially we were under anticipation that Treasury will be releasing their guidance early summer, but now we're hearing from Treasury that that will be pushed back to later this year. Keenan, do you have anything additional to add to that?
I've mostly heard the same, but that the self-certification form could still come this summer, but there will be a whole second tranche of kind of the real details around how a fund needs to manage its investment portfolio and a lot of technical questions later in the year. So we might get I'd say expect kind of a slow trickle of information.
Thank you. The next question is, how can eds and meds participate in this conversation or in a particular program? In my slide regarding the attainable housing, the strategy really could go in a couple of different ways. Number one, as we recognize that one way to achieve workforce housing, in this particular model, the city potentially could create, or a locality could potentially create a city-owned or city-controlled opportunity fund, and then work with universities as well as their major employers who may have unrealized capital gains. Those dollars could be transferred to the fund dedicated to creating new housing opportunities for their employees. That's just one example. Particularly on the housing side. Another example for our universities specifically, oftentimes universities have a project pipeline of new ideas or business models that are coming out through their grad students or even their own research or entrepreneur or incubator spaces. And those are the actual, as Keenan pointed out, are the ideal type investments that would fit this model. So from a project pipeline development, the university should be thinking about how it can identify those projects amongst their research centers or amongst their students. And then lastly, if in terms of the housing space, universities, eds, hospitals could also be thinking about how they can leverage their existing unrealized capital gains to help support workforce housing locally. Next question is, how can success be measured over time? And this is really largely and I think I'll turn that over to Keenan to answer that. Keenan, from EIG's perspective, what's the definition of success?
That's a great question. From our perspective, I think it's going to be seeing those the job and establishment numbers on the slides that we showed. Or the opportunities on the slide that I showed increasing over time, especially the number of businesses in these zones. But then also, whether if zones no longer qualify, that'll be the best measure down the road if the people living in them have benefited from the new growth that comes in. Because the eligibility of a zone is based on the people living there, not the economic activity within them. So that's I'd say we should look out for the opportunity zone graduation rate really to see how successful it's been over time.
Thank you, Keenan. Next question is this program geared towards project-specific or portfolio-specific investments? And I think I will just take this one. It's actually both. In many cases, you will have a situation where there's a specific project where the Opportunity Fund can invest directly in. But I think one of the beautiful parts, and as Keenan pointed out, because it's a long-term patient capital, this could also provide a portfolio basis where the fund can not only invest in a business, but also can invest in projects as well. It really would be dependent upon the investor and the sophistication of the individuals who are working on that. Next question.
Qualify as a zone.
So Keenan, there was a question regarding the longevity of this program, and can communities apply to be in an opportunity zone if they have not been designated? So I'll turn that over to you.
Okay, so no, the window is closed unless Congress, a couple years down the road in the future decides to renew the program. But as it is and as written now in statute, The designation, so zone designations expire in 2028, so 10 years from when they were designated, which was this summer. And that is really, that's the point at which an investment enters a zone. The zone needs to be qualified. But the portfolio of opportunity zone assets that funds hold will outlive zone designation. So you can still buy opportunity zone property in 2027, hold that because it was qualified at the time of purchase, hold that until 2037 or beyond, and even though the zone isn't still an opportunity zone, the asset is still qualified opportunity zone property, so that would still be tax exempt at the time of sale, way down the road.
Thank you. Next question we have is, what can we be sure that public transit is coordinated? So I think in this question, Gary, is there, in your work right now in Michigan, how is public transit, and particularly as you guys focus on creating walkable communities, how are you guys coordinating your efforts at the state level?
We're not really doing it at all yet. Like I said, one of the meetings I have today is with the Department of Transportation. We've had 2 conversations with our meta group, of which they're a part of, but it hasn't come up. Right now, we just had a huge funding increase from the legislature for transportation projects, so it's something we have to now bring together to see how it works.
Great, and I think that really goes to the heart of the question. Now is the time for all agencies, housing, economic development, and transit to be working together. In the example I pointed out before, in addition to the opportunity zone funds potentially investing in property around transit, you have to also think about there could be potentially new businesses that could operate transit or provide design, build, and operations for a transit agency. The way this program is designed, it provides a level of flexibility that we haven't seen before, and I think there will be a lot more ideas and concepts about how the funds can support public transportation on the ground. Now we have reached time, and based on the level of questions that are still coming in, we will definitely be filling these questions as part of the FAQ that will be coming out later this week. If you have additional questions, please feel free to tweet us at Locust Developers or give me a shout at my email address, which is ccodes@locustdevelopers.org. At this time, I just want to thank Keenan and Gary for their participation on this webinar. And if people have additional questions or would like to have access to the webinar, it will be placed on our website. And again, email me directly if you have additional questions. So with that being said, thank you for participating, and we'll be in touch soon once the guidance comes out from Treasury to provide basically a deeper dive on the legality and accounting efforts to support the creation of opportunity funds on the ground. Until then, have a great day.
Yeah.
I hope that that was very informative, and as mentioned, if you have more questions, please email ccoes@locust.org. That's CCOES@LOCUS.org. I want to thank you all for tuning in. Please keep an eye on the Local First AZFoundation.org events page for upcoming webinars. As a reminder, these are monthly installments, so keep an eye out on our website for those upcoming webinars. I want to thank you again and have a great day.